Hello everyone. Welcome to today's data learning talk. This afternoon, we're very happy to have Utkarsha Agwan from University of California, Berkeley. So today she will talk about the role of data and machine learning in enabling distributed energy resources. Utkarsha, the audience is all yours.
Thank you, Siva. Hi everyone. I'm Utkarsha, and I'm in the final year of my PhD in electrical engineering and CS at Berkeley. I'm advised by Professor Kostas Panos and Professor Kameshwar Pula, and the research interests in our lab are basically buildings and flexible energy resources as they relate to the power system. So my PhD in particular has just been looking at a variety of energy resources. So things like electric vehicles or backup batteries, smart thermostats, any energy resource that is not a centralized huge power plant, and then figuring out how to control or optimize its participation in the power grid. Um, and yeah, I'm coming up towards the end of my PhD, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the research that I've done in this area. But really, the way I view this talk is that it's a primer on some of the problems that can be solved with data and machine learning, and then a call to action, because we definitely need more data scientists and more people with machine learning expertise to work on these problems, um, just for the world and for climate change in general. So the majority of my PhD research has been motivated by trying to mitigate climate change. This pie chart is showing us the 2018 US greenhouse gas emissions by sector. Now, this is 2018 and this is the US, but this pie chart is pretty representative of just global emissions as well. And as you can see, there are a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in the commercial and residential sectors, industrial sectors, and transportation, which are all tied to the consumption of energy in some form. So in the industrial sector, it could be heating, producing industrial grade heat. In commercial and residential sectors, aside from using electricity and the energy and the emissions related to electricity, there's a lot of heating. In transportation, it's obvious you're burning fuel to get cars to move, to get buses to move. And all of those energy uses are causing emissions at some scale. So if you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which we must if you want to survive as a species or even as a planet, the first thing we can do is just use less energy. Because when you use less energy, you shrink all parts of this pie. Um, and so you end up having fewer emissions. And one way to do that is energy efficiency, for example. The second thing you could do is clean the electricity generation mix. Now, the reason that I am calling out the electric power sector is because that's something that we do know how to decarbonize pretty well. We can make solar panels that are very, very cheap. We can build them at scale. We can build wind plants. We have access to other clean energy technologies, which could reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we are emitting just from producing electricity. And so the second thing that you could do is clean up this part of the emissions mix. The third thing that you do is electrify all of these other loads. And so the hope is that you clean your electricity generation and then you move everything else to consuming electricity, thereby also cleaning up all of those sectors. And distributed energy resources can actually help with all three of these things. So as I said, distributed energy resources are just anything that's small and is not a big centralized power plant or a big utility scale plant. And DERs like smart thermostats or smart lighting can already help us use less energy. So if you can automate them, if you can set them on schedules or make them motion sensing, be smarter about how you preheat or pre-cool your space, you can end up using less energy overall. The second thing DERs can help us do is increase the share of clean energy. So rooftop solars actually, so I'm in California, Berkeley is in California, which is a state in the United States, which has a high solar penetration. And the policies ended up being such that a lot of people have solar on their rooftops. They end up making some money off of it, or they at least consume the clean energy themselves. And they also are now increasingly investing in backup batteries and just enabling flexibility in general inside their homes. This also translates to commercial buildings and industrial buildings, which will have rooftop solar or some form of backup battery, which then becomes a distributed energy resource, which helps them consume clean energy more than they would have if they were just buying it from the electricity market. The third way DERs participate is by helping electrify loads. And when you electrify energy consumption, that is, you make a vehicle an electric vehicle, you change a gas furnace into a heat pump, you get a hot water heater that is electric instead of gas. All of these loads are now resources on the power grid, because what you can do is move around EV charging. You can change how you operate your AC or your heating system, and you can change when you're heating your hot water. And so these resources add flexibility to the power grid that was previously not available. And the way DERs have really taken off has been, the story has been one of declining costs and increasing adoption. And this has set up a virtuous cycle. So as more and more people invest in solar or in EVs, manufacturers manufacture them at scale. That brings the costs down. Now there are more people who can afford this. And this virtual cycle just gets set up where we have more and more DERs coming onto the grid every single day. Now, since DERs are distributed, they're fundamentally different from the kind of power generation that the power grid was set up for originally. So what the power system is planned for is having this one big generation source, and then you have transmission lines and distribution lines enabling one directional power flow from like the big generator to all of the consumers distributed across cities. What's happening now is that these DERs are located in different locations than the older plants. So you don't necessarily have the infrastructure set up to take energy from them. And they're also on the distribution grid, which is operated at a lower voltage and may not be set up for bidirectional power flow, or may not have the capacity to enable that kind of power flow. Apart from these challenges of just like the planning level and the system level, DERs are different because they're the resources that we're talking about when we say DER are fundamentally uncertain. Having a solar rooftop results in fundamentally uncertain solar generation because it depends on when the sun shines. You don't really get to control when the sun shines. If you have an electric vehicle, you primarily use it to drive around. You don't think of it as a battery that's serving a function on the power grid. And so sometimes the EV may not be available when you're trying to charge it or discharge it. The second way that they're different is that system operators, like the people who are operating the power grid and who are making sure that it's stable and reliable, may not have insights into the operation of these DERs, because it's individuals and homeowners and office building managers who own and manage these resources. So the utility or the system operator does not know what's going on with an EV at any point of time or with a battery at any point of time. The third is that because they're sited on these grids that are not necessarily ready for a distributed energy generation or the backflow of power, they can cause issues like and they can cause issues in voltage. And then we've come up with all of these ways to do frequency regulation or to manage the voltage on these distribution lines. So these are a whole host of like power system issues that DERs can lead to. And if you want to integrate, so the first thing is, ideally, you want to integrate all possible distributed energy resources into power system planning and power system operation, because most of these resources are clean. And if you manage them, they demand side flexibility. So now if you have a lot of solar or a lot of wind that you can't control, you can compensate for it by controlling the energy consumption. And that's what DERs enable. So the world needs to integrate more DERs onto the grid, but there are these three main technical challenges with integrating them. The first one is that energy consumption and resource availability is uncertain. So it depends on For example, if you're in a commercial building or a residential building, your energy consumption depends on how you're using the space. Are you running a machine learning training job that's taking up a lot of compute? Are you just sitting at your desk and reading a paper? Both of those actions have very different footprints on energy consumption. What's the weather outside? Is it cold? Is it hot? What's the insulation in your building like? And have you left a window open? The causal factors for all of these uncertainties are also not necessarily measured, or even if they are, they're not available widely. For example, even if there's a building that's measuring occupancy or the number of people in the building or a number of people in each room, um, that data can lead to serious privacy issues if you start sharing it or using it for forecasting or reveal it to third parties. The third technical challenge is that the effect of control actions on these resources is also uncertain. So because you don't know how you're using the space or what the temperature is inside or outside, if you decide that your control action is going to be to change the temperature of your heating system, you don't know what the effect of 1 degree Celsius change in that temperature set point will lead to in terms of energy consumption, because you don't understand the thermal dynamics of the space that well. This brings me to my first project. So this was just an overview of DERs and the challenges that they pose so far. I'm now going to be talking about 3 different projects that I've worked on over the course of my PhD. And I'll try to highlight the ways that machine learning can help us handle some of these technical challenges. So the first project was on local energy markets. The premise of this is that you've got these buildings with a lot of on-site demand, distributed energy resources like solar rooftops or batteries. And the role of the batteries is that they enable flexibility. Because if you have a lot of excess solar generation, what you can do is charge your battery when your solar rooftop is producing power, and then discharge it at a later point in time when either the costs are lower or the emissions are lower, or you don't have solar but you're still consuming energy. So and that's just one example of how batteries can help enable flexibility. What we realized is that if you've got a building that tries to buy battery capacity that meets its own peak demand or its own peak generation, that can often lead to a resource that is oversized and underutilized. So, for example, if there's a building that has a big battery, what they can do is share that battery resource with other local buildings around them. And that essentially involves setting up an energy market where you can trade either energy or the time sharing of these resources. The program or the scheme that we're considering in our model is that of a prosumer aggregation. The word prosumer is just a mashup of producer and consumer. That implies that these are not just consumers; they can also produce energy. Produce energy, and the way they trade energy with each other is through this virtual aggregation. So they'll have an aggregator which controls the information flow. So they can post prices, they can post bids, they can do settlement, so they can match up who consumed energy with who produced energy. They can send control signals through the aggregator, but the actual power flow is still on the utility owned power network. So you don't have to set up a new network. You don't have to set up a new power network. The only thing that you need is a signaling or a communication network and some sort of smart control algorithm. And then in the end, this aggregation can always go to the utility and go to the power market as a whole to buy energy that it was not able to either self buy energy that it did not manage to procure from within the aggregation. So once again, these are separately owned buildings. They have their own resources. They want to trade energy with each other, and the aggregator enables that by enabling the sharing of information. Now, these aggregations enable energy trading and sharing and also improve utilization of resources. But what you need to do in order to enable them is to control the resources in the aggregation. So there needs to be some way of ensuring that power when someone wants to buy energy, there's someone available who's trying to sell energy at the same time. And there are two ways to control the resources in this aggregation. So the first one is just direct control. So the aggregator gives each battery a control signal and tells them exactly when to charge, when to discharge, and what net power draw there should be. But this is difficult to implement if you've got independent entities with their own objectives. So a building that owns a battery might not necessarily sign up to have its battery controlled by a third party. The second way of going about this is through transactive control. And transactive control just means use price as a signal. So the aggregator gets to send out a signal that is some quantification of it's a quantification of the demand supply imbalance or some other objective that the aggregator might have. And this price signal can influence operation. Now, the way pricing is done in aggregations has been studied for many, many years. And there are a whole host of iterative pricing heuristics and also methods from optimization like ADMM, which can inform you what the price in such an aggregation should be. But in all of these pricing techniques, they require each participant to estimate their energy consumption ahead of time, because that's how pricing will work. There will be a price that's broadcast. Each individual participant will calculate their own objectives and then relay some sort of update back to the aggregator. The aggregator will use that update to update the price, rebroadcast the price back. So either you will have an iterative scheme or you will also require them to have a forecast of how much energy they plan to consume in the next day. And those are the two things that we are sort of trying to get, that we're trying to eliminate. Because imposing this burden of an iterative market where you have to have forecasts for each individual prosumer might be too much for example, home, which has an AV or which has a solar rooftop. That home is not set up with the capacity to do those kinds of things. And so the fundamental question that we asked is, can a reinforcement learning agent be trained to offer prices that benefit all of the prosumers as well as the aggregator? The model for a prosumer and an aggregator is such that the prosumer cares about minimizing its electricity cost. So it gets a price signal from the aggregator. That's the price that it needs to pay for energy. And by the way, this price is time varying. So it's different at different points of time in the day. So there might be cheaper periods of time and there might be more expensive periods of time. The prosumer will likely try to charge its battery during the cheaper periods and then discharge during the more expensive periods. And the aggregator, we modeled using two different behaviors. So we modeled two different aggregators, essentially. The first one is just a for-profit aggregator, which is trying to maximize its profit from operating this market. So the profit is just the money that it receives from the consumers minus the money that it has to pay to the utility from which it is procuring the balance of energy. The second aggregator model is a market-solving aggregator, which tries to achieve equilibrium, which tries to make a demand-supply balance happen, essentially. So that's the setup of the aggregator and the prosumer, and now we're trying to design a reinforcement learning controller to set these prices. And we use a soft actor critic architecture to design an RL agent that learns how to set prices in a day-ahead manner. So the setup is such that the reinforcement learning controller will use historical information, forecasts of future consumption, future solar generation, forecasts of future prices, and will use them to generate. So for example, today's the 14th of May. So the controller will set a price for the 15th of May and broadcast it on the 14th of May. The prosumers will have access to these prices ahead of time and will then be able to optimize their energy consumption or their battery scheduling according to these prices. The RL controller only observes their actions after the fact. So at the end of 15th May, the RL controller will be able to say, hey, these are the prices that I set. This is what ended up happening. This is what the prosumers ended up consuming. And this is the profit that I made. So for example, for the for-profit aggregator, the reward is just the just like a negative sign in front of the profit. The RL controller is trying to the reward is just the profit. So the RL controller is trying to maximize the profit that it makes. And you can train it by providing it information on what happens whenever it sets a price by telling it what the profit ended up being. Similarly, for the market making aggregator, you end up supplying it information about how well the prices lined up, how well the prices that it forecast that it set ahead of time lined up with what the prices should have been if it had known ahead of time what the prosumers were going to do the next day. And in both of these rewards, we're actually able to see that the RL controller does learn how to set a price. And so we modeled a couple of different resource scenarios. This is a scenario with a lot of DERs, so a lot of solar panels, a lot of batteries. And then we also modeled a scenario with fewer resources. And it turns out that for the profit maximization and for the market solving case, we get a controller which we can see that it learns, and now we need to quantify how well it learns, right? When we quantify it, the first thing that we found is that it takes a lot of data and a lot of iterations to actually get to the point where it's broadcasting a price that does not lead to a lot of losses. And we were able to identify these 5 challenges that any real life RL controller will have to get through in order to implement it in a real life prosumer aggregation. And this is, by the way, this is not a pipe dream. These aggregations exist, and they are being controlled with other pricing mechanisms. So it's perfectly reasonable to imagine that we could try to come up with an RL controller with better performance than those pricing mechanisms, because the RL controller would be data driven in some way. The challenges that you face are safety. So do you broadcast a price that leads to safe operation and does not, for example, make all of the batteries discharge at once and lead to a power imbalance or some equipment failure? The second is just data efficiency, which I referred to. The third is optimality. So how close are your prices ahead of time, the forecast prices? How close are they to what they would have been if you had perfect observability, or if you know exactly what the model of each of those prosumers was? And so this work was pretty much the first work, I think, doing reinforcement learning for pricing in energy markets, in these small local energy markets. And we're actively working on how to manage some of these challenges, but this is something that remains open and I believe is an area in which researchers can engage. All right, I'm going to move to my second project now. And if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me or put them in the chat. The second project that I worked on is on flexible loads. And I just want to take a minute to explain what I mean by flexible loads. So last year in September 2022, the California power grid had this surge of demand, surge of energy consumption around 5 p.m. And it was really critical. They told us that we were going to lose power because they just did not have enough energy generation to meet the demand of all of these people running their ACs during the heat wave. What they did do is they sent out this emergency alert to everyone. So I got this text message on my phone asking me to turn off my devices. Apparently, people responded. They were able to bring the energy consumption down to a level where the grid was now safe and they didn't need to implement blackouts because people voluntarily reduced their energy consumption. And that is, in a nutshell, what demand response is. Demand response is inducing consumers to modify their energy consumption for some incentive or through some other voluntary mechanism. And there are a couple of different time scales at which demand response or flexible loads can play a role. So over the course of years or seasons, if you're talking about seasonal long-term shifts, that is referred to as load shaping. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got demand response that responds on the time scale of minutes or seconds. And you can use that kind of flexible load to balance momentary imbalances in supply and demand on the power grid. And so there's a spectrum of time over which consumption flexibility is important. And in all of those time scales, it can add value to the power system by just being the resource that can be moved, as opposed to solar and wind, which cannot be controlled and which cannot be moved. The way flexible load is controlled is by controlling these resources. So if you have an AC system, so HVAC is heating, ventilation, and AC, if you change the temperature set points, or if you change the fan speeds, or you modify EV charging, or you change lighting levels, all of those are resources that are used right now on the power grid to provide demand flexibility. And so, for example, in the US, we have this big supermarket chain called Costco. And they participate in demand response programs where sometimes you'll go in the middle of the day and they'll have a lower lighting level, or in the evenings. And that will be because they got a signal from the grid telling them to reduce their energy consumption. The same goes for modifying EV charging. As they're adding more and more public chargers or even private chargers, they build in these schemes where you can get paid to stop charging your EV when you get a signal telling you to do so. So all of these resources are currently being used to provide demand side flexibility. And there are these four challenges or these four questions that need to be answered if you want to effectively integrate load flexibility. So the first one is just an estimation problem, figuring out what capacity or what amount of energy consumption you can move around. The second challenge is a controls problem. So how do you control it? How do you send the signal? How do you get the device to do what you want it to do? The third is adding new sources of load flexibility that are currently not part of flexible loads. And that is just automation or investment in infrastructure that can make dumb devices into smart devices, like smart plugs or smart HVAC. You can actually use a smart plug in California. There are programs where they'll send you free smart plugs and you can plug your devices into them and then get paid money when they control your devices for you. The fourth question is the fourth challenge is optimizing the participation of these flexible loads in electricity markets. And today I'm just going to be focusing on number 1 and number 4. So the estimation problem and then the optimal bidding or the optimal contract problem. And I'm going to talk about the optimal contract problem first. The way these programs are set up is that the consumer promises to reduce their energy consumption in the future and then receives an incentive, some sort of payment ahead of time. So they have a contract size, they get paid ahead of time for that contract. And then when they get the signal, they have to reduce their energy consumption by their contracted value. If they fail to do so, they have to pay a penalty. So there's this incentive penalty structure where you want to balance your expected revenue from the program while also minimizing your penalty risk to make sure that you don't end up overbidding in the hopes of getting a high incentive payment and then, failing to reduce your energy consumption when asked to do so. The fundamental source of uncertainty is that the load flexibility itself is uncertain. You don't know what your future usage patterns will be like, whether you will be able to reduce your energy consumption to the extent that you promised to. And a way to get around this is to do probabilistic optimization. And for that, you need a probabilistic forecast of future load flexibility. It turns out that if you do have a probabilistic forecast, so for example, this blue line is the probability distribution of future load flexibility. So the x-axis is load flexibility, and this is the probability distribution at some point of time in the future. The optimal contract size or the optimal bid is a quantile of this distribution. And that quantile is just determined by the incentive, the penalty, the risk aversion, the probability of there being an event where you're called upon and asked to reduce energy consumption. And risk aversion is just a metric which quantifies how much the consumer cares about the balance of expected revenue and the worst case penalty risk. And so increasing risk aversion means that you care more about the penalties or the worst case, the tail of the distribution, than you do about the expected revenue. And increasing risk aversion will reduce contract size. So this is pretty intuitive, because it's just a classic probabilistic optimization problem given a forecast of uncertain behavior in the future. And the real value for this result comes when you start thinking about aggregations. So one individual home or one office building is too small a resource to participate directly in flexibility markets. And the way you can enable their participation is by forming aggregations, where you bundle together multiple buildings, multiple electricity consumers together, and then submit a single bid into the power market. The aggregate capability of all of these resources is just the sum of load flexibilities of all of the participants. So what's going to happen now is that earlier the utility or the power system operator would send a signal to each individual consumer, telling them to reduce their energy consumption by C. Now they'll interface with an aggregator. The aggregator will send out a signal to the thousands of consumers that it's aggregated and get them to reduce their energy consumption. What the value that having an aggregation adds to each of the participants is that it spreads the penalty risk. Because basically the penalty risk comes from this side of the distribution. So you thought that you were going to have a spread of load flexibility. It turns out that you're on the lower end of the spread, so you don't have as much load flexibility as you thought you would. And now you have to pay a penalty. But if you're paired up with another consumer that has the same spread, but turns out to be on the higher end of the load flexibility spectrum during that particular event, you balance each other out and you don't have to pay a penalty. So the value of an aggregation is that it spreads penalty risk and increases overall participant revenue. And to figure out what makes a good aggregation, you can use a complementarity metric, which is just a measure of historical correlation of performance. The idea is that if historically you had resources that were not correlated, they will continue to not be correlated in the future. And so even if one of them fails to perform, the others won't fail to perform, and overall you will have balanced penalty risk. This is similar to how stock market portfolios are constructed. The idea over there is that you look at historical correlation to figure out if stocks are correlated, alongside a whole host of other complicated measures, I'm sure. But that's the basic underlying principle. And now there's in the work that I was talking about so far, there's an assumption, which is that you have access to probabilistic forecasts of future load flexibility. And constructing these forecasts is actually not an easy task. And there are a couple of challenges. So the first is that these load flexibility events are rare, and they are rare by design. You don't want to ask consumers to frequently change their energy consumption. This should very much be something that happens rarely, assuming, of course, that it's not automated. So you're manually calling up humans and telling them to change some parts of their energy consumption, or causing them to go through some discomfort. Because these events are rare, we have very few data points where we can actually observe performance of flexible loads. The second is that a lot of these events occur during times that occur during situations that you might not have seen in historical data. For example, the peak heat event that I was talking about a couple of slides ago, that was an outlier. It only gets that hot once in the year. So you can only observe energy consumption or energy flexibility during that one time. The third is that there are a bunch of causal factors like occupancy of the building and usage patterns of the building, which you may not measure. And so you don't have access to the data that could help you determine the dynamics or the behavior of your electricity consumer. Other than these forecasting challenges, there are also a couple of confounding factors. So the first one is that any energy flexibility is essentially compared to a counterfactual. Because what is load flexibility? Someone calls you and tells you to reduce your energy consumption, and then you reduce your energy consumption. The way they figure out if you actually did what they asked you to is by comparing it to a counterfactual of how much you would have consumed if you hadn't received this signal or you hadn't received this instruction. And so this counterfactual is called a baseline, and the baseline can often be a source of error because the counterfactual can just be wrong or be constructed through a heuristic that doesn't make sense. The second is that consumers are not properly incentivized to curtail. So many of them fail to perform. This is not a market design failure in as much as it is just that the market is so nascent and small. So a lot of the consumers never have to pay the penalties, because if they were made to pay the penalties, they'd just stop participating. And so the appropriate levels of incentives and penalties aren't present, and you don't get them to perform when you want them to. And the way commercial aggregators currently deal with this problem is by having humans have human-to-human conversations to onboard new resources. So commercial aggregators exist in the US at least. They control smart AC systems, EV charging, batteries. They aggregate thousands of these resources to submit bids into power markets, especially in California. There's a market that started in 2019, and there are a couple of aggregators that participate in that. The way they onboard new resources is by having these conversations, and because they need to have individual conversations, they are limited by that, and they cannot onboard consumers fast enough. The second problem that they face is that because they do not have a good idea, they do not have a good forecast, they don't know what the spread is going to be, and they end up being very conservative in their contract sizes. So there is a lot of demand flexibility that is just not available in the power system because we don't have good ways of estimating it. Now, the climate impact of this is if we did have access to reliable demand flexibility, we could integrate more solar or more wind onto the grid because we would have flexible demand to accommodate all of that variability. And a project that I'm working on right now is building these forecasting tools for flexible load, for flexible energy consumption. And I'm not going to show you all of my data or all of my work right now, but this is just to give you an example of what it looks like. The green line in the background is the baseline. And as you can see, sometimes the counterfactual can be wrong. The blue dots are the energy consumption during normal periods of time, and the red dots are during a demand response event. So the building received some sort of signal telling them to change their energy consumption. In some cases, you can see that actually caused the energy consumption to spike up. So this data is very messy, and I'm currently trying to figure out a way to make sense of it and build forecasting tools for this. But this is an open challenge. It is not solved. The companies that are trying to make money off of this have not been able to solve it. And there isn't adequate researcher interest, or at least researcher effort in this area. And I guess the call to action is that, hey, machine learning experts, come and work on this. It's critical to get more solar and wind on the power grid. I'm going to move very briefly to my last project, where the last project that I'm talking about today, where we try to figure out what happens when you change energy consumption to reduce emissions. Now, modifying energy consumption is expensive because you either have to pay people to consume energy differently, or you have to invest in automation infrastructure like smart plugs or signaling mechanisms. And ideally, you should be making these measures as less frequently as possible. What we're trying to investigate is whether there are a few time periods in the year where it makes sense to shift load or shed load because they have an outsized impact on emissions. The way we're looking at the emissions impact of energy consumption is through the marginal resource. And the marginal resource is just basically the last energy generator that will be turned off or turned on if more people consume energy. And the emissions intensity, the carbon dioxide emissions intensity of these resources are called the marginal operating emissions rate, or MOER by short. And what we see, I think this is for 2018. This data is for 2018, but it's largely similar over years. And this is for the Northern Californian grid. So what we see is that there's a seasonal pattern in marginal emissions with a dip in the summer. Now, that is because California has a lot of solar, which ends up producing a lot of energy during the summer. And the bigger the share of solar is, the lesser you have to use more polluting resources, which brings down the marginal emissions. And the yellow bars are actually a histogram of all of the 5-minute readings of MOER. So as you can see, there's a huge spread in MOER, and there are certain periods of the day, of the year, which have zero marginal emissions. So these are the periods in the middle of the day in the summer, or when solar production is high. Now, this is just telling us what the CO2 intensity looks like. We try to look at what we need to do if you want to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and we try to look at the time incidence of these high emissions periods. It turns out that all of the peaks are from December to April, and most of the peaks occur in the winter, in December. What this tells us is that if we want to prioritize emissions reductions by changing energy consumption less frequently, we should try to prioritize that in the winter months. So, for example, reducing heating energy consumption or any of the loads that are active during the winter would be much more beneficial in terms of reducing emissions than trying to control loads that are active during the summer. For example, pool pumps or cooling. This is just for energy, for just a straight up reduction in energy consumption. So if you reduce energy consumption, this is the benefit that you would get. Usually, energy consumption isn't just reduced, it is shifted. So for example, if you have a washing machine or a dryer, if you don't use it right now, you will use it at some point of time in the future. Similarly, if you have an EV, if you don't charge your EV right now, you will charge the electric vehicle at some point of time in the future, and that is load shift. Now, for load shift, what we care about is the difference in marginal emissions across time. And so we look at the marginal emissions drop off across the course of 1 hour. So what basically we're looking at loads that you can shift the consumption for up to an hour before or after they were originally going to be consumed. And it turns out that there is a sort of Pareto curve where most of the time periods with this MOER drop off, there are very few time periods which will give you most of the emissions reductions if you try to prioritize load shifting. Let me explain the figure on the left first. What this tells you is that if you shifted load for 20% of the year, you would get, if you shifted load for around 20% of the year, you would get 10,000 pounds of CO2 emissions reductions. Whereas if you shifted it for all of the year, you would get 14,000 pounds of CO2 per kilowatt hour of energy consumption shifted per time period. So basically, the first few time periods are constituting the bulk of the emissions reductions that you can achieve. And most of these high MOER differential time periods occur during the middle of the day. This is again, this is because there is so much solar on the Californian grid that you have some time periods in the middle of the day which have zero emissions intensity. And so if you can shift it from some high emissions intensity to zero emissions intensity, that is a huge reduction in emissions. What this does tell us, though, is that if you get your forecast of emissions wrong by even an hour, so for example, if you predicted that you would have high emissions at 4 p.m. but low emissions at 3 p.m., if you get that wrong by an hour-long window, you can actually increase emissions because you will be moving it from a low emissions time to a high emissions time. And so what this really drives home is that either the control has to be super dynamic, where you can control loads based on a live emission signal, or you need to have really good forecasts of future emissions intensity. So with that, I am at the end of my talk. The main takeaways that I wanted to highlight are that data and machine learning could be really important, particularly for forecasting problems, but also to enable control of these resources that we might not have good models for. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Utkarsha, for the nice talk. So for the audience, in case if you have any questions, you can either raise your hands and I will let you unmute yourself and speak that out for your questions. Or you can also type your questions in the chat and I will speak that out to Utkarsha. So both way works for us. Yeah. So in fact, for myself, I do have a couple of questions. So I think I can start. So my first question is, so for all these like nice data-driven product that have been developed, is there any has been like used in industrial scenarios that has been, for example, commercialized by the enterprises, or they're still like prototype for the moment?
So none of my work has been commercialized. These forecasts of carbon dioxide emissions intensity are used commercially right now. So there's a nonprofit called What Time, which makes these forecasts and also measures historical emissions intensity. And they provide these forecasts to pretty big companies like Nest. So Google Nest is the smart thermostat. And so there's a mode on Nest where you can say, I want to use green energy, and they will optimize your heating or cooling based on the emissions intensity data that they get from What Time. So they actually do use these forecasts right now, for Nest devices at least. And this forecasting problem, I'm actively working with an industry partner to develop this forecasting. And the idea is that if we get to something that works well enough, then they're going to use it, because they're really suffering from having conservative bids right now. They're not able to make as much money as they would, and having good forecasts will enable them to be more optimize their bids a bit more.
Okay, yeah, I see that. So actually, I have another question. So regarding when you're saying that you can predict the prices of the market, etc. So I was wondering if your model will be able to take into account the real-time information from the market so that it can adjust the prices, or it's more like based on historical data you have trained and you made the fixed term predictions. So yeah, I was thinking maybe with reinforcement learning, there's a way to take into account the real-time market information, right?
Yeah, no, there definitely is. You can definitely do that technically, where you take into account real-time information and then modify prices, and then have the reinforcement learning controller publish live prices or dynamic prices. So that is something that reinforcement learning or a controller can do. The problem really is from the presumer's side. So if you have resources that are trying to schedule their energy consumption ahead of time, they may not necessarily be okay with having a live or a dynamic price that gets updated during the course of the day. And that's just like conventional wisdom, that electricity consumers don't want a dynamic price. They want a fixed price, and they want to know ahead of time so that they can plan their energy consumption out. That will definitely change as you have more automation or more flexibility resources on the side of these presumers, which can adapt to having a live or a dynamic price. But as long as there is some amount of human in the loop, it's difficult to have a dynamic price be implemented from their side.
Yeah, I can imagine that. That's always like the X factors in the markets, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see if there's questions from the audience. So yeah, I think they're a little bit shy today. Maybe it's the end of the day. It's already quite late in the UK. Yeah, actually, I have another like final question. So I think most of your test cases, they're based on the US market, right? Have you seen any generalizability of your models that can be applied in the market of other countries?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. So the way I view it is that the Californian grid just has a higher solar penetration. So not wind, but we do have a lot of solar on the grid. And as power grids around the world try to decarbonize, they will move to a resource mix that has a lot of solar or a lot of wind. And I know the UK already has a pretty green grid compared to other countries in the world. And the problems that these grids will face will be similar. So the source of the uncertainty might be different. So you might have a wind heavy grid or a solar heavy grid, or instead of having distributed solar, you might have centralized solar. And so the sources of the uncertainty will be the same, but the fundamental uncertainty will remain. and the need for using demand-side resources to tackle them will also remain. So the way I think the exact market mechanisms might be different and the exact, so for example, the premise of this work was that you can set up an aggregation like this. Now, not all markets allow this. So these aggregations could in practice only exist in some territories. But the idea of sharing storage or of having dynamic control or day-ahead control using reinforcement learning is something that could translate to multiple power grids.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Thanks, Utkarsha.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Let's see if there's any questions from the audience. So if not, I think I'll be able to close today's talk. So I would like to thank again Utkarsha for accepting our invitation and for giving such a nice talk. And thank you for the audience to join us this afternoon, and looking forward to seeing you in our next data learning talk. So have a nice evening, and so for Utkarsha, have a nice day then. Yeah, so see you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Cesar. Thanks, Sibo. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, bye-bye.